I made a video called "Has John Harris Lost His Mind?" and I
Did you
published it
send me
on
that?
Saturday. You're not in it, sorry. I mean, I just did it, you know.
No, no, no. Did you send me the video? I didn't see
I don't
that
know.
one.
You should be subscribing to my channel, my friends. That would actually help a lot. Having a subscriber would be a pretty important thing. It would help us out. I got a
Okay,
second.
yeah, I have to say you have really ran with this in a way that I have not expected,
Well,
and now
I
I'm like,
talk to myself a lot. And now I basically talk to myself out loud and put it on YouTube, which I think is what most bloggers do, right? So
that is what most bloggers do. Wait,
yeah,
which,
it's the most recent. It's kind of the most recent one right now, and it's the only one that has gotten views, to be honest. I think the one other one I did about inflation got 10 views.
what was the thing about you sending me that clip?
Well, I sent you a clip because the morning after he put up the specific video that you sent me, he took it down and apologized for what he had put in the video. And
Oh,
remember,
wow.
yeah, and I was chatting with you while I was watching the video. It's like, oh my God, like it's not that he's necessarily coming from a bad place himself, but there was a lot wrong with his perspective there, or like the perspective that he kind of posted there. Let me grab you the link. So have you found it yet, or do I
I
need
got
to
it.
get
Yeah, I
into it?
found it.
Yeah. Um, and I
That
mean, what
perspective.
it boils down to is, what it boils down to, what my counter argument mostly boils down to is that, frankly, some of the things that NATO did after the Soviet Union collapsed had nothing to do with Russia anymore. NATO, amongst other things, is one of the reasons probably why Europe didn't have any wars on the continent for the longest uninterrupted time ever. And so I genuinely think that some of the things that happened after the Cold War with NATO expansion had nothing to do with Russia. It started to have more to do with Russia again relatively quickly after Putin took office because he started all kinds of crap, right? Um, but to some extent, I mean, if you look at the way Yugoslavia devolved into a decade of ethnic warfare, and the way that other former Soviet countries were struggling to find sort of a new place for themselves and to figure out a way to participate in the rest of the world. Joining NATO just kind of made sense, along with joining the actual economic umbrella and participating in Western economies as well, which is what they had to do. So
No, that argument is bullshit.
you think?
Yeah, I mean, the unequivocal intent and purpose behind NATO was to defend against the Soviets. And so if you repurpose, like if you go and later say, well, we, by the way, also had this other reason, and that's why we're expanding, then uh, then there is an enormous onus on your end to justify that argument because it just sounds like bullshit. It's like I'm trying to think of these um, cases. I don't know why this one comes to mind, but there was this blog like decades ago that I frequently reference where some police officer was explaining why it's illegal to flash your lights to warn somebody that there's a speed trap. And the argument went like this: you're only allowed to use your lights to warn about hazards, and a speed trap is not a safety hazard. And you can look at that and you can like make some interpretation about the law behind the use of um, flashing your lights to warn people, and you can make some strict interpretations. But anybody with half a sense is going to look at that and be like, "Yeah, that's bullshit." So that's the way my mind is processing the statement you're
Okay.
making.
I don't think it's bullshit. I don't think it's bullshit. I think that for a long time, countries didn't. I think that the biggest argument to me against the idea that NATO has been expanded to border against Russia is that no one just expands NATO. You have to ask to get into NATO, and you have to have a reason why you would ask to get into NATO.
So
And
why
and
didn't, back in the Yeltsin days, Russia join NATO?
the issue was that Russia said, like, and this is actually something where I think John Harris's video was accurate. Russia wanted to be treated as an equal to the United States, and the United States wasn't quite having any of it. And the reason, the way that manifested was that Russia said, okay, we would like to join NATO as well and be part of this peace alliance. But if we do that, we want to alternate who has the military command post. Because, the NATO secretariat does rotate between different NATO members, but the supreme military command of NATO is always held by the United States. And I think that made perfect sense, because nobody would have wanted to hand a title called the Supreme Military Command of NATO to, for example, the Germans, right? So in order for the Germans to participate in NATO, there had to be some assurance that not every NATO country gets the title of Supreme NATO Military Command. So Russia wanted to be treated as a leader of NATO to the same extent that the US was a leader of NATO, and that they couldn't align on. And so instead, they formed some other shared defense agreements that were maybe BS or maybe just made up. It's hard to say. But there was a separate defense agreement between NATO and Russia that established like a separate kind of joint council, and that was basically like, I guess, in case China were to go ballistic and start to attack the rest of the world or something like that, right? It was like it was kind of like that. But that I don't think that the notion of Russia potentially joining NATO was entirely insincere, but they would have joined NATO like any other country, which is definitely not something commensurate with Russia's ego, right? It's just not Russian. It just doesn't fit into Russian self-perception.
Is that really it? Like, there's also the whole, a lot of European countries are very, like Poland is very, very skeptical still of Russia, and they would have made a stink or made that NATO joining difficult.
The time when we were actually, by the time that Poland was actually in NATO, this is once again true, because by the time Poland was actually in NATO, Russia was busy suppressing the Chechens and starting to they started to have other issues. But I think right during the Yeltsin era, like the early Yeltsin post-Gorbachev era, I think there was a relatively high degree of sincerity on both sides. And the processes, the times when the former Eastern countries, I mean, we can look this up and make sure, and I'm happy to post corrections, but from what I could tell, the times when some of the former post-Soviet countries started to talk about joining NATO, it was not, there wasn't any particular like tension with Russia at that time. They were basically still in the spirit of trying to figure out what's a good new stable arrangement. Yeah. I mean, I think to me the biggest issue with the argument that NATO is some kind of gun pointed at Russia, specifically a gun pointed at Russia, right? Like an aggressive thing, is that NATO doesn't start wars. Like even the United States can't order NATO to start a war. It's not in the charter of NATO. It's just not. It's never been in the structure, and it's never happened. And the United States,
also
there's been. I think so.
Argument.
You think so? Why?
Because all the military posturing works that way. It's always defensive. Like Cuba was also, sold as defensive after the Bay of Pigs, which was, they had some argument there, right? And I guess what you want to ask yourself is, how would this run in reverse? Like if Mexico allied with China, which I think they are fairly strongly allied with China. If China started arming Mexico, possibly with ICBMs, what would be the United States reaction?
I mean, I think that is like the core of this kind of argument, but I don't think there's any actual ICBMs that are not of local manufacturers stationed in Eastern Europe in particular. Like, I don't think any major weaponry is really stationed there. There's a few troops that got deployed. We're talking about on the order of 5,000 to 8,000 troops that got deployed to those regions. They're symbolic. They're just so that if you actually attack, then you are in fact triggering a war with NATO, and that's about it. And I think the other issue with that argument is that it's not like Europe is incapable of nuking Russia on its own. I mean, Europe has two nuclear powers. You don't need, tens of thousands of nukes like Russia or the US have. You really only need like a couple dozen to mostly do most of the job that you're going to do with nukes. And so this is not, I don't think this is that valid. And then the other thing is, like the wars that the United States actually started thus far generally have not involved NATO. I mean, NATO didn't join the Korean War. South Korea wasn't a member of NATO. And the US decided to defend South Korea against North Korean attack. They did it on their own. In the Vietnam War, when the US decided to participate and try to stabilize Vietnam, they did that on their own. And after the war on terror, which is the only time they've managed to actually argue that NATO should get involved after like 3,000 Americans died on American soil, when they went into Iraq, they didn't really do that as NATO. They were able to convince some other NATO countries to join, but it was voluntary, and there were quite a few NATO countries that didn't join because they were like, this is not really a NATO concern, right? So NATO is not a military that the US can just go into war with. It's not that. Even though the US has this title of military commander, I consider it, I mean, I can certainly see the point of it being a logistical choice at the time when NATO was formed, and probably a politically controversial one to change for anybody within NATO, right? Like, I do think that now, if somebody like Russia were to join NATO, like say Putin put down, his arms, say he were to backtrack out of Ukraine after losing Syria just now, as well as losing, Armenia effectively as a protectorate, he might as well say, okay, you know what? We're going to try this whole thing again. I'm going to go back to selling you oil and gas. We're all going to get filthy rich in Russia. We're gonna all be much better off than we were, 5 years ago, and we'll stop doing this crap, right? Nothing would happen to them. But if they were to try to join NATO and then say, okay, well, we want a rotating military command, of course that wouldn't work. Like, nobody would trust them now, right? So you can potentially include them in an alliance, but you can't. Yeah, especially right now, like you wouldn't be able to trust them to actually like give them this title, even if it is somewhat ceremonial. I would argue it's somewhat ceremonial, just because it strikes me as a bit of a matter of logistics, that you don't rotate the military command structure every 4 years, because if you have a unstable military command structure and there were a serious event that threatened one or more NATO countries, you wouldn't be able to respond as well if you were constantly changing your chain of command. So changing the civilian aspect, the secretary aspect, but leaving the military one stable kind of makes sense. I mean, recently, like it was just last year or 2 years ago, the Dutch military went under German military command. So within Europe, the Dutch military is now like officially integrated into the German military, because it was like, well, alone our military isn't going to do any good. And military alliances on Europe shouldn't only be under the NATO umbrella. So there's other countries that have separate agreements with each other just in case something happens to NATO.
So is there a threat, let's say like economically, to Russia if Ukraine becomes more EU friendly?
No.
Like if Panama closed access to our ships, maybe we would have a problem with it.
I mean, the funny thing in a way is that even with Russia starting the full-on invasion of Ukraine, by and large, pipelines of oil through Ukraine to European countries continue to operate. And that's because they looked at the amount of revenue that the oil pipelines were generating, and relative to the gas pipelines, it wasn't that much. So for the most part, those pipelines kept working and selling oil to Europe. And Ukraine largely stuck to those economic agreements, even in this circumstance, because it didn't want to lose the support of Europeans. Although they may have, either they at a government level or somebody very ambitious within Ukraine did probably blow up Nord Stream 1, right? I mean, that seems to be very much the case that they blew up Nord Stream 1, but they kept gas pipelines through their own country actually oil pipelines through their own country actually flowing to some extent, although they might have also siphoned off oil to run their military, And of course, in recent years, now that this has gone into full-on, long-term warfare, I think that is no longer the case. Like, I think that's probably like made sure that shit gets shut down, or that any oil you pump into Ukraine, we're going to use to fuel our own, or fill our own reserve. I think that was a more recent development. Now, I mean, I really think we should at some point like do our best to dive into the reasons why the hell would Russia even do this, right?
Don't you think? To me, it seems like maybe NATO is the cover, but the economic ties and influence over Ukraine is useful for Russia, and they don't want to lose it.
I mean, I think they're getting it at a cost that is,
and
not.
They didn't, and they didn't know that it was going to cost that much. And in classic Russian tradition, human life is not very expensive, so we'll just throw bodies at the problem.
In 2020, where I don't know if you remember this, but there was a huge problem just delivering computer chips to the world because because of issues in the Panama Canal, amongst other things. Europe decided that the minerals to create those chips and the chips themselves were now a strategic resource on the same level with oil and energy security. And it has been a rule on Europe for Europe and the US since I think Winston Churchill set this like 3 supplier minimum. Like he did this as a policy on oil back when the West became totally dependent on oil and realized this. Because they wanted to make sure that there was enough competition and that it couldn't just be held to the axe by one country deciding to raise the price or stop supplying. And it looks like, and I mean, I went through, I found the article, like the quotations from the article basically indicate that Europe started to consider this kind of resource equivalent to oil and gas in terms of strategic necessity for having redundancy and for having their own supply. And it was literally July 2021. And then you start to get this, saber rattling, these accumulations of troops. And I think just on an economic level, it could be that what Russia was hoping to do was, first of all, just have another material that they're a strategic supplier of, because they were already a strategic supplier of Europe's gas. And maybe they figured Europe wouldn't do anything because they were too afraid to lose that supply. And then potentially to tie itself closer to China, right? If they could say, hey, look, we prevented all this stuff from becoming Europe and Europe becoming a big competitor in the technology industry, we can sell the stuff to China, and now we have a trade alliance with China that we wouldn't have had otherwise. That to me seems like it might be an economic strong enough incentive that you bother going to war. That's my hypothesis. That's my theory. We can't know, right? We can't know what they were really thinking. By the way, I've found transcripts of every single thing that Putin said before he invaded Ukraine, and maybe someday I'll be bored enough, or I'll have a bored enough audience that somebody would look at me like going through it and trying to pick it apart, and say, okay, like how much of this is valid and how much of this is BS and how much of this is indicative. But he keeps coming back. One thing I will point out is he keeps coming back to this concept that really Ukraine owes Russia money. Like it basically, Ukraine has owed Russia money the whole time, and Russia has forgiven a bunch of loans, and whatever money Ukraine has should be Russia's money. That's basically what a lot of this came down to over and over again. There was a lot of stuff about NATO too, but the question is really, I have severe issues with the idea that the argument about NATO is even sincere. Like honestly, I could see how NATO expanding is an insult. Like I could see how NATO expanding, could be like it could be an insult, but I don't think it could be an active threat unless you were planning to start shit.
Oh, I agree that it's more likely a cover for like having the influence, having control of more land.
Yeah, I mean, it does turn out that the land, especially in eastern Ukraine, is strategically valuable, and something like 90% of all mineral deposits that could be used for computer chips and circuits in all of Europe are in Ukraine. And they didn't really fully know this or have any plan to do anything with this until apparently 2021. And then in 2022, and then it was like articles, where they were announcing these trade agreements, and then in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. So if you say like, if it takes you about 6 months to get your army ready, right? It's effectively like Russia took about 6 months, 7 months after those agreements were signed to get their army ready. And I wouldn't completely ignore the fact that they ended up sending a hammer covered in the blood of a traitor to the European headquarters, not NATO headquarters, right? Not Ukrainian headquarters, and not to the US. They package mailed a sledgehammer covered in blood to the European headquarters after they executed their defector Wagner mercenary back in mid 2022. So there was like definitely some symbolism aimed directly at Europe.
I didn't know that. That is messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I happen to think that let's say, like, minerals tend not to be what goes on in the minds of people like Putin. I think they're more just arbitrarily power focused.
Yeah, that's why the just being insulted by NATO thing might actually be what drives him. But that's kind of scary if you think about it, right? I mean, I want to see him as someone who at least at one point was calculative. I mean, we all thought of him as basically rational. I was going to mention this earlier. I don't know if I've told you about Mark Galeotti before, but I would actually highlight him as almost a source for our channel or for this channel, because he's like the one genuine Russia expert that I've spent the most time listening to. And he started a podcast during the Corona crisis just because he had nothing else to do because he couldn't lecture. And he normally split his time between a university in England and university in Moscow, teaching courses about each other to each other effectively, right? And he was an advisor, a diplomatic advisor in the UK for a long time. And so he started this podcast called In Moscow's Shadows, and he did it in 2019, like during COVID, late 2019. And then I made it a point to listen to every single episode up until Navalny's death, I think. I went up until Navalny's death. And the fucked up thing about it is he also treated Putin as someone who's effectively rational, right? Like not psycho, just calculative. But then leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, he started making predictions about what Russia might realistically do, other than the things that were floating around as possible hypotheses that they might do. And he always underestimated how crazy Russia was. At every single turn, every single prediction he made ended up being wrong. He predicted that there would be saber rattling. He predicted that there would be no invasion. He looked at the manifesto and the draft agreement with the US that the Kremlin put on its website a couple of months before they started the war. And then he looked at the speeches that Putin gave, etc. And he still was like, nah, they're already doing enough there. And like, at every single point where he tried to see Russia as like calculative and rational, but annoyed, and looking for some way to have an actual effect, like some kind of negotiation strategy that would actually accomplish something, I think he turned out to be completely mistaken. It was unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. But that leaves this whole notion of how rational they are definitely in danger. The only kind of rational economic reason right now that I can think of is these additional mineral deposits and the fact that Ukraine had a really serious corruption problem, and there were already Russian oligarchs involved in trying to find a way to make sure that anything valuable in Ukraine would end up benefiting them. And I could see that they maybe had some of Putin's ear, and that they maybe got scared about these agreements between Ukraine and EU. But the notion that Ukraine was now getting closer to joining NATO than they had been in 2008 was kind of nonsense. Like there was no indication that the countries that were consistently vetoing Ukraine's inclusion in NATO were about to change their mind anytime soon at the time when Putin invaded. And there was no indication at the time that Sweden or Finland were particularly interested in joining NATO and risking some kind of an escalation with Russia.
Really, I kind of saw that this all started with when Viktor Yakunovich got kicked out, right? Didn't the Crimean invasion happen after that? And it's slowly the ties to EU really picked up with Zelensky.
Yeah, well, hang on. So there was Viktor Yushchenko and there were the two Victors. Yakunovich, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Viktor Yakunovich. And now I'm looking stuff up just for transparency, but yeah. So Yushchenko, Yakunovich got kicked out. I mean, there was tussle over the political allegiance of Ukraine, for sure. It could be that Russia was trying to turn it. I mean, of course, this is the Western narrative, if you will, but it could be that Russia was trying to turn it into a vassal state, which I think you could argue Belarus is now. I think there would be a pretty strong argument to be made. And that the West wasn't having any of it, right? They saw enough of a strategic priority or regional priority in Ukraine. Again, I think this has to have to do something. Has to have something to do with resources in Ukraine, because else they would have done the same thing for Belarus. So I don't think it's entirely out of the goodness of Europe's heart or their idealism that they helped make sure that that Yakunovich didn't stay in power, or that this move towards Russia wasn't successful. But would that justify an invasion, right? I mean, you can trade. Like you can trade. It's not like Russia was not included in trade. Like that's what drives me crazy about it, right? It's not like Russia wasn't included in trade with Europe. It's not like Russia wasn't literally at a strategic level included as a trading partner. Russians were getting filthy rich. Russians were buying up English, stadiums, and no one stopped them. No one, like they had insane amounts of money because they were given access to the Western market. They were included in exchange with technology. There weren't really any barriers put in their way to effectively becoming an economy and a technological country at the basis of a Western country, even though they had been decades behind by the time the Soviet Union fell.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's not much of a rational reason, honestly. I mean, I don't know that they could have genuinely thought that NATO would at some point attack them. I don't see that. I just think that your interpretation of Putin as just wanting more power might be correct. That it was just not rational. He was just annoyed that he wasn't able to meddle where he wanted to meddle. That really would make him this kind of evil genius figure, right? That has no real rational reason for doing anything that they do, just so they need to be hatching some kind of evil plan at any given moment to try to get more than they already have.
Yeah, I keep going back to that notion that Mexico and China, like what would happen if we lost Mexico as like a close ally and they aligned with the adversary of ours? How would that look to the Americans?
Well,
regardless of what the legitimate probability of some kind of conflict would be.
I don't know. I don't know if you can compare it to NATO, just because I don't think that I don't think that you would have a situation. I think you would never be able to argue that you would have a situation where there's a decision maker in the alliance between China and Mexico other than China. And Europe is not known as a vassal state. I think one issue that I have with this is I think it looks like, in the Russian perspective, the concept that a country can be smaller but make its own decisions just isn't there. But look, do you think that Japan, as a member of the Marshall Plan, was a strategic threat to China while it's existing there for the last 50 years? Do you think that it was put there? Just what about South Korea? Is it a threat to China that South Korea is there, trying to have a Western economy and trying to have democracy?
Yeah, actually it is.
You think
And
so? Okay.
well, and to
Not to North
demonstrate that
Korea.
if China actively has interest in keeping North Korea separate from South Korea,
But
and they
people
would
have left that alone, like since the Korean War. Like no one is trying to cop. Like everybody's just said, okay, fuck it.
I know, but let's say South Korea had been making progress in um, swallowing up North Korea, China would have a problem with that.
Now, if South Korea at some point were to do it, would it be completely impossible that maybe the US didn't actually tell them to? Like, do you think that there's any like South Korea also has a chance to make its decisions, right? It's its own
Yeah,
country.
sure. They maybe didn't forget that the US had anything to do with it. I'm just saying that China would have a problem with South Korea being closer to China, or Korea
Possibly.
being closer to them. And
Yeah.
they do have this interest in
I
like
think
having these
everybody
like buffer zones.
buffer states. I mean, I think that everybody has a legitimate reason to I think we have a pretty much shared incentive in the world at this point to respect borders. Like even if they're not popular, right? Land wars just have no positive outcome. I mean, that's basically what my takeaway is. Just leave the borders alone, right? Um, yeah, yeah. But I mean, look, the West also really approached China pretty openly in the 1990s. I mean, I think that in this interest, like China wouldn't be the powerhouse that it is now if the West hadn't lowered most of the trade barriers during the 1990s and early 2000s. There's no way.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. Among some other things.
Amongst some other things, but the main like I do think that one of the propaganda things in American politics that I really want to stop hearing is the word globalism and that it's somehow bad. I mean, maybe right now it doesn't look like globalism is securing world peace, but you have no idea how long or how long ago we might have already been at war if we hadn't had globalism, and we have no idea how quickly we might descend into war if we don't re-engage with globalism, right? I still think that like having mutual trade and having a mutual benefit economically to having a collaborative relationship, a collaborative relationship. I don't see a good alternative to it. I don't know of one. I mean, the only other concept is everybody joins NATO or some other, make up a new organization if you want, like give the UN military power and say that the UN will come and smash any UN country or any country that attacks any other UN country, and say that as soon as you attack another country, you're out of the UN, right? Like give it that power, and then you have a global, security umbrella.
Okay. Yeah, lots of problems with that, but we'll get to it next time. It was
Yes.
good chatting with you.
All right, man. See you. Bye.
See you.